The Grenadier at first glance looks like your typical damage-dealing class, with a machine gun and a grenade launcher. While they certainly can do a lot of damage, they actually function more like an initiator or opener. This is because grenades both destroy cover and shred armor. Their launcher allows them to hit more targets from further away, and later on they get several abilities that weaken enemies for the rest of your squad.
Here, catch!
Grenadiers are by far the most important class for me. Any mission that I go on where I can't take at least one Grenadier makes me quite worried. Weapon attachments for the Grenadier are interesting in that, at least for me, they tend to shift over the course of the game. In the beginning, the attachment I like to put on my Grenadiers is a stock. This is because Grenadiers have one of the worst aim stats, so they make great finishers when you're out of grenades. As the campaign progresses, I tend to focus more on expanded magazines, or auto-loaders if I don't have any, because Grenadiers get abilities later on that take a lot of ammo. Once my Grenadiers are getting up to Captain rank 4, I like to start swapping stocks for scopes, to help with their shooting abilities. And after that, hair triggers are always nice for the extra action. In terms of equipment, it should go without saying that you want a lot of grenades. Either frag or plasma, possibly swapping one later for a proximity mine. You could also bring a heavy weapon, for an ability we'll discuss later, or a second set of blue screen rounds. The two ability branches for Grenadier are Demolition's Expert and Heavy Gunner. Demo focuses on cover removal and explosives, and Gunner focuses on shooting and buffs. The Grenadier's basic ability is Launch Grenade. This lets them use their launcher to fire grenades further and with a bigger blast radius than you'd normally get from throwing them. This is probably the most important ability in the game, at least in the first half. With grenades, it's not so much about the damage, because most enemies have too much health, it's the cover destruction that's the important part. You want to grenade an enemy to expose them and then have someone else shoot to finish them off. Thrown grenades have a range of 10 tiles, with a 3-tile blast zone. Whereas launched grenades have a 14-tile range, and a 5-tile blast zone, and these numbers get even bigger when you have an advanced grenade launcher. Thrown grenades have such a small blast radius that you can't normally hit more than one enemy at a time. So fighting groups of enemies is more difficult because each enemy takes 2 people, one to remove cover and one to take the shot. But with the grenade launcher, you can easily hit 2 or more of them at once with just one person, which is way more effective. I'm always trying to save my grenade launcher rounds for when multiple enemies are active. If I'm dealing with a single target, I'll usually try to use a thrown grenade instead, that way I have the launcher rounds for when I need them. The only downside to this ability is that, like all explosives, on lost missions it will increase the rate that waves spawn. Even then you'd still want to consider it, because the aliens will also target the lost. The first 2 abilities at corporal rank are Blast Padding and Shredder. Blast Padding is a passive ability that gives your soldier 1 point of armor and reduces explosive damage to them by 2/3. The added point of armor is a nice little bonus, but the explosive damage reduction is almost completely pointless. The only time enemies will ever use explosives against you is if your soldiers are reasonably clumped up, which you can avoid with proper spacing. What makes this worse is that it doesn't even apply to environmental explosives, like cars and propane tags. So really you're only getting this ability for the point of armor, which would be pretty poor by itself, but the other ability is just non-negotiable.
See that one?
Shredder is also a passive ability, but this one makes your cannon attacks shred armor, where higher tier cannons shred more armor. This is another ability that's so incredibly powerful that you're just handicapping yourself by not picking it. By the time you can get this ability, they'll already be starting to field advent mechs, which have at least 1 point of armor, and most of the mid to late game enemies also have some armor. The only other way to remove armor is explosives, which you have a limited amount of. As an example, on Commander difficulty Advent mechs have 8 HP and 2 points of armor. Assuming you've got a squad of 4 with each of the base classes and no shredder, if all 4 of them roll min damage with standard shots, then that'll still leave the mech with 1 HP. Not even considering any other units that might be with it. With shredder, you'll still only do 2 damage on the first cannon attack, but you'll shred 1 point of armor. So now you can definitely kill it with your 2 other 4 damage shots, leaving you with your specialist free for any additional actions. I will always pick Shredder as my first Grenadier ability. The comparison just isn't fair really. At Sergeant rank, you get Demolition and Suppression. Demolition is an active ability where you can destroy an enemy's cover by shooting at it. It doesn't do any damage to the enemy, and it takes 2 ammo and has a 3-turn cooldown. This ability is actually pretty nice if you're out of grenades or want to save them. It has several interesting properties that maybe aren't immediately obvious. Its biggest downside, for example, is that it has a roughly 80% chance to hit, which means it can and will miss occasionally. In terms of benefits, while it won't completely remove vehicles being used as cover, it will instantly detonate them. Which means you can get some somewhat consistent damage in the early game. It will also instantly destroy trees. When using frag grenades, it often leaves a stump which still counts as full cover. Plasma grenades will instantly destroy most trees though. Finally, you can use it on lost missions to avoid speeding up the spawn waves. While it's not an amazing ability, it can be quite useful in some cases. Suppression is also an active ability that takes 2 ammo, this time applying an aim debuff to a target and giving you a reaction shot if it moves. It has no cooldown. This is intended to be a way to lock an enemy down, preventing them from moving or reasonably shooting back at you. Unfortunately, enemies in XCOM 2 usually try to move as their first action, regardless of what's happening. This means that the aim penalty aspect of suppression is usually not a factor, since the unit stops suppressing when they take the reaction shot. The other downside is that cover is factored into reaction shots, even if the unit is moving away from it. This means that if you suppress someone who's in cover, especially if it's full cover, which is normally what you'd want to use suppression for, you're quite likely to also miss your reaction shot. And finally, suppression only affects aim-based attacks, so they can still use all the other nasty abilities they have like micro missiles, poison spit, mind spin, etc. On the times where I have taken suppression, I've very rarely benefited from it, despite how useful it could potentially be. At Lieutenant rank, you have Heavy Ordnance and Holo Targeting. Heavy Ordnance is a passive ability that simply makes your grenade slot give 2 grenades instead of 1, meaning you can have up to 3 in a mission. The only thing worth mentioning is it works on all grenades, including the Frost Bomb from the Alien Hunters DLC. It doesn't work on Mimic Beacons, because they're a gadget and not a grenade. There's not much to say otherwise. It's a nice ability to have but nothing special. Holo Targeting is a passive ability where any aimed cannon shot will also apply a +15 aim bonus to the target. This applies to all of the Gunner branch abilities, including Suppression, Chain Shot, etc. It combines really well with Shredder, in that not only do you shoot first to shred the armor, but you also make it easier for the rest of your squad to hit. Holo Targeting is really useful on the mid to late game enemies that have really high defense stats. Normally your only option is to either close the distance or use elevation bonuses, which aren't great. The +15 aim bonus is a massive chunk though that really helps to bring them back in line. I usually end up taking Holo Targeting because a lot of the mid to late game enemies don't take cover, so you don't need the grenades as much, and the holo targeting bonus on priority targets is just so useful. For Captain rank, there is Volatile Mix and Chain Shot. Volatile Mix is a passive ability that makes grenades do an extra +2 damage. Pretty straightforward, it just makes grenades even better. This means your plasma grenades will go from doing 4 to 5 damage, to 6 to 7 damage. It only increases the blast damage, not the tick damage from things like gas or incendiary grenades. By the time you get it, most enemies will have enough health that it won't one-shot kill them, but it's still nice to have. Chain Shot is another one of the multi-damage abilities in XCOM 2. It's an active ability where you take a shot with a -15 aim penalty, and if it hits you get to take another shot. It has a 3-turn cooldown. Before it was patched to have a cooldown, this was basically just an inferior version of the rapid fire ability on rangers. With rapid fire, you always take both shots regardless of whether the first hits or not, but Chain Shot requires you to hit the first shot in order to take the second. Now that rapid fire has a 5-turn cooldown, Chain Shot is kind of a cheaper but more risky alternative. The thing is that Chain Shot naturally has a longer range, because shotguns are worse at distance than cannons and you don't want to give up the laser sight on a shotgun for a scope. So it's easier to hit the first shot with Chain Shot. Of course, it's also worth mentioning that Chain Shot also applies holo targeting, so if you do manage to get that first hit, you're reasonably likely to land the second one as well. It's just a really good ability if you can get a good shot. I generally prefer Chain Shot because you can use it as many times as you want. Volatile Mix is obviously dependent on how many grenades you have. At Major, you unlock Salvo and Hail of Bullets. Salvo is a passive ability where using a grenade or a heavy weapon as your first action doesn't end the turn. This just enables your Grenadier to give up moving for even more firepower. You can use this to either launch a grenade or a heavy weapon, and then follow up with a standard shot, or if you really want to, you can just launch 2 of them back to back. A useful thing you can do with this ability is to launch a proximity mine at an unactivated pod, and then go on Overwatch. That way if the pod moves, the mine detonates and activates them, then your Grenadier also gets to take an Overwatch shot as well. This is one of the abilities in the game that I like to double back for in War of the Chosen using the training center. Personally I prefer the other ability, but it's very strong. Hail of Bullets is an active ability where you fire a shot that's guaranteed to hit, but it takes 3 ammo and has a 5-turn cooldown. This ability is really strong, especially with Shredder and holo targeting. There are certain enemies in the game with a lot of armor, HP, and defense. So this ability is incredibly useful for allowing you to deal guaranteed damage, soften them up, and also make them easier to hit for the rest of your squad. Of course you can also just use this ability to hit an enemy who's in full cover. Honestly this ability feels a little broken to me, because as long as you have enough ammo, you can basically ignore any stats that you'd normally have to consider. I generally take this ability to help with the really tanky enemies, but Salvo is also a great choice. Finally at Colonel, we have Saturation Fire and Rupture. Saturation Fire is an active ability where you take a shot at every enemy and piece of cover in a cone shape. It also costs 3 ammo and has a 5-turn cooldown. Depending on how grouped up a bunch of enemies are, this is basically just a very high action economy ability. Because it's a cone-shaped ability, it doesn't benefit from holo targeting. But like Demolition, you can use it to detonate certain pieces of cover like cars, though that's less useful at this stage in the game because enemies have too much health. Otherwise this is just good if you have a bunch of targets, none of them really high priority, and you want to just get as much damage out as possible. Rupture is yet another active ability. This time it's a shot that's guaranteed to crit and will apply the Ruptured status effect, which makes the target take +3 damage from any additional attacks. It takes 3 ammo and has a 3-turn cooldown.
Hard target, minimal damage.
This acts as another form of opener, weakening an enemy for the rest of your squad. This is mostly good for the really tough enemies, as a hail of bullets with Shredder and Holo Targeting will usually weaken most enemies enough to be easily killed. You could take either Saturation Fire or Rupture, they're both good in their own way. I usually take Saturation Fire since I already have Chain Shot and Hail of Bullets for single targets. For my Grenadiers, I usually take Shredder, Demolition, Holo Targeting, Chain Shot, Hail of Bullets, and Saturation Fire. I don't really use the grenade launcher to deal damage, it's mostly to destroy cover, so I don't really need any of the abilities for it. This build is the catalyst of most squads. You have the abilities to cripple the really tough enemies, and you also have the launcher and other abilities to deal with the rest of the mobs.